Welcome to the Division of Local Services webinar relative to completing the tax rate form A-2 for enterprise funds. My name is Jennifer McAllister and I manage training initiatives here at DLS. Before we get started, I want to remind participants that this webinar will be recorded and posted on the DLS YouTube channel for future reference. The PowerPoint presentation will also be shared along with any links referenced. Please submit any questions you may have using the question and answer function on the menu bar, and they will be answered at the end of the presentation. Today's webinar will be led by Deb Wagner, Director of Accounts from the Division's Bureau of Accounts.
Thanks, Jen. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So today I'm going to talk to you about completing the tax rate recap form A2 for enterprise funds and also cover some other related topics that you need to understand in order to complete the form, such as what an enterprise fund is, what retained earnings and indirect costs are, and also general fund subsidies. This is the Enterprise Fund Manual, and Jen, I think, put a link in the chat for this, and it's IGR 2216 and covers all of the topics related to adopting the budget for, related to adopting, budgeting for, and reporting for enterprise funds. So everything you need to know is in this Enterprise Fund Manual, and it gives good examples of budget articles and completing what we're doing today, completing the recap form A2. So the first thing I'm going to cover is what is an enterprise fund. So if you're new to municipal finance, if this is your first go around with completing a tax rate or involved in municipal finance, enterprise funds are established under General Law, Chapter 44, Section 53F and a half. And this law went into effect in around 1986. And prior to that, there weren't enterprise funds. Such activities were accounted for in either the general fund or a special revenue fund. And so what an enterprise fund does is provides an accounting framework for municipal services with fees, similar to a private business. So it really is just an accounting mechanism. And it separates the revenues and expenses from the general fund. So it gives great visibility to how this particular business type activity is doing financially. One thing I want to stress is that an enterprise fund is not an autonomous entity. It is merely another department of a city or town. As I mentioned before, it's just an accounting mechanism to account for the activity separately so that there's visibility again to how the enterprise fund is doing financially, but it is not a separate department or a separate entity. So how do you have an enterprise fund? Well, you have to go to a vote of your legislative body to adopt an enterprise fund for a particular enterprise fund or a particular business type activity. And so the article would look something like, to see if insert the city or town name will accept the provisions of Chapter 44, Section 53F and a half of the Massachusetts General Laws establishing, and you have to be specific about what type of service is going to be accounted for in the enterprise fund. So you would insert that there. As an enterprise fund, effective whatever the fiscal year is. And usually it's effective July 1st of, if it was for 26, it would be effective July 1st of 2025. And so that would be the beginning of fiscal year 26. And each enterprise fund requires its own separate vote to be established. And as I mentioned, they start at the beginning of the fiscal year, July 1st, usually. And you have to operate an enterprise fund for a minimum of 3 years before you can take a vote to rescind it. And like most things in Mass General Law, the way you undo something is you just take a vote to unwind it like you voted to establish it. And so it would simply be to see if the city or town will revoke the provisions of Chapter 44, Section 53F and a half of the Mass General Laws, ceasing whatever the service is as an enterprise fund effective fiscal year, and you would state the fiscal year. So why would you adopt an enterprise fund? Well, for one thing, it identifies the total service cost. And the service costs would be direct costs, indirect cost, and capital costs. And we are going to talk about indirect cost. It was possibly the most asked pre-submitted question. So we're going to spend a good amount of time on indirect costs. It provides management information on revenues and expenses and what the performance of the enterprise fund is. And it retains surplus and investment income within the fund. And we're going to cover what that means also. So which types of services are eligible to be an enterprise fund? And this is also covered in the enterprise fund manual, but utilities like water, sewer, stormwater, trash disposal. One that was added recently is accounting for broadband as an enterprise fund. It's sort of viewed as a utility. Also, cable TV, public access, healthcare, things like ambulances, hospitals, and nursing homes. There aren't a lot of hospitals and nursing homes anymore in Massachusetts. A lot of them have closed, and I mean municipal hospitals and nursing homes. There used to be a lot of them. Recreation type activities like skating rinks, pools, golf courses. We have a lot of golf course and skating rink enterprise funds, and also beaches. And then transportation activities like airports, docks, and wharves. So enterprise fund budgeting. And we're going to go over what the revenues, available funds, and expenses of an enterprise fund are. So the budget should be proposed annually by March 1st, and it's subject to the appropriation process. So someone will put together a budget if it's the select board that's in charge of the enterprise fund, or if you have trash services, it might be the DPW director or something like that. But someone will put together a budget, just like you put together the municipal budget. There will be an activity around putting the budget together, but then it will go to a vote of the legislative body, just like the city or town budget does. In a town, that would be town meeting, and in a city, it would be city council, but the budget has to be voted. Some of the revenues of an enterprise fund are user charges, rentals, grants, and investment income. So, and you're going to see when we're completing the Form A-2 that there's a line in the revenue section called Other Departmental Revenue underneath the user fees line. And rentals is an example of another departmental revenue. Say, for example, you rent out a particular facility at the Park and Rec for an activity to an outside group or something. That's an example of a rental income that might be considered another departmental revenue. Available funds, a lot like the available funds of the general fund, you have retained earnings, which we're going to cover in a minute. Excuse me, premiums, assessments, like something like betterment assessments, and also stabilization funds. You can have an enterprise fund stabilization fund. It will not be accounted for in the enterprise fund. It will be in the trust funds, just like a regular stabilization fund would be. But it would be for the enterprise fund purpose. It would usually be funded by a vote from retained earnings. Again, we're going to cover that in a minute. And it would be set up as let's say you have a skating rink stabilization fund, and you might use those funds to make repairs to the rink or the building or something like that. And that enterprise fund stabilization fund can only ever be used for that enterprise fund purpose. Special purpose stabilization fund for a city and town can be voted to change the purpose. You can't do that with it. Always has to be for the purpose of the fund that funded it. And so that's very important to remember. And if you vote to close that stabilization fund at any point in time, the retained earnings that were voted to fund it would close and go back to that enterprise fund. And some of the expenses related to an enterprise fund are salaries, operations, capital outlay, and indirect costs. And again, we're going to talk about indirect costs in some amount of detail. So why would you complete recap Form A-2? Well, if your community has voted an enterprise fund under Mass General Law, Chapter 44, Section 53, F.5, for an eligible service voted to begin in that fiscal year that the tax rate's being set for, you would complete the A-2 for that enterprise fund or any other pre-existing enterprise fund that was established to begin before that. So you would always complete an A-2 for an enterprise fund that you've voted. So some key concepts that I think it's important for you to understand before we move on to completing the actual Form A-2 are retained earnings, indirect costs, and general fund subsidy. So we're going to now cover each of those topics. So what are retained earnings? Retained earnings are the free cash of an enterprise fund. They work just like free cash of the general fund when we certify your free cash. They may be appropriated for any legal purpose related to the enterprise fund only. Retained earnings of an enterprise fund can only be used for a purpose related to that particular enterprise fund. And retained earnings can't be expended until certified at the same time free cash is certified. We certify retained earnings with your balance sheet at the same time that we certify free cash. And like free cash, retained earnings expire at June 30th of the next fiscal year end. So if we certified your June 30th, 24 retained earnings, those retained earnings expire as of June 30th of 25. And even if you have a balance left in that retained earnings, if there's some retained earnings left that you haven't expended by the time they expire, you still can't appropriate them until we recertify them when you submit your June 30th of 25 balance sheet. And then any amount that you have left will become part of that next certification. So even if you have a balance left, just like free cash, even if you have a balance left, you can't expend those once they expire at the next June 30th until we recertify those retained earnings. So let's talk about indirect costs. Everybody had a lot of questions about indirect costs. So what are indirect costs? And it's a pretty simple concept. So no need to be nervous about it. So indirect costs are costs that are fully appropriated in the general fund budget. The whole appropriation is in the general fund budget, but they get reimbursed by the enterprise fund to the general fund for the enterprise fund's share of those costs. And some examples might be the accountant or collector treasurer's or town manager's salary attributed to accounting for or doing any other work related to the enterprise fund. So we know that the accountant maintains the books of the enterprise fund. The collector treasurer might process transactions related to the enterprise fund. For example, if they're collecting bill payments for user fees, they would be doing account collections for the enterprise fund. And a town manager might spend part of their time as well on enterprise fund activities. Some other costs include health insurance costs for enterprise fund employees, and those would be pretty easy to determine. You'll know that Sam is an employee of the particular enterprise fund, and Sam's health insurance costs, the portion of it that the town pays is X dollar amount. So you would know exactly what that cost is. There's no need to try to estimate it. Also, debt service, similarly, if you've decided that the enterprise fund is going to pay for its own debt service, it's a known cost. You know exactly what the cost is for that enterprise fund project, so you know exactly what the debt service would be. Some communities determine that they're going to share the cost of debt service with an enterprise fund, like the general fund will pick up 50%, the enterprise fund will pick up 50% of debt service for a particular project. Sometimes the general fund, in some of the last mile communities, they determine that the general fund would pick up all of the cost of the debt service, and the enterprise fund for the broadband activity would not pay for any of it. But that's a local decision, how much the debt service is going to be paid by the enterprise fund or the general fund. So the portion of the debt service that will be attributable to the enterprise fund, but it would be 100% raised and appropriated in the general fund, because you wouldn't want to split up that vote. You don't want to split up a particular payment into two votes. You will vote it all in the general fund, but then the enterprise fund is going to reimburse for part of that. Also, information technology infrastructure and support, property and vehicle liability insurances, legal services, independent audit services. So when your community has their annual audit, a portion of the audit is related to the enterprise fund. So the enterprise fund might bear a portion of the cost of the annual audit. Actuarial services related to other post-employment benefits and other costs that may be agreed to and documented. And one of the purposes of accounting for an enterprise fund, setting up an enterprise fund such that the costs are separate from the general fund, is that you will know what the total cost of the service delivery is. And so that's why you would attribute indirect costs to the enterprise fund. So there's 4 different ways that you can determine what enterprise fund portion will be attributed to the enterprise fund, what portion of the cost will be attributed to the enterprise fund. First method is actual cost, and we talked about health insurance. You know exactly what the actual cost is. Debt service, you know exactly what the actual cost is. So that's one method. You would know exactly what the cost is, and so you would know exactly how much to attribute to the enterprise fund for the indirect cost. Proportional, and you would take the enterprise fund's total budget, net of debt service, and divide it by the general fund's total budget, net of debt service, and you'll get a percentage. And so you would take that percentage and apply that percentage to costs like the accountant's salary or the treasurer collector's salary or the town administrator's salary. That's one method, proportional. That's another method. And sometimes you might use a combination of these. So for example, if you're talking about debt service, you might use actual. If you're talking about accountant's salary or treasurer collector's salary, you would use proportional. So you can use a combination of these methods. Another is estimate of support, and that's where you would do a time study, and the accountant might, for a week or a couple weeks or a whole month, and sometimes people engage consultants to do this, but the accountant would keep track of how much time she spends on enterprise fund related activities. Treasurer collector might do the same with the town manager, or any other costs related to that the enterprise fund might benefit from. You could do a time study of how much time is spent on enterprise fund activities. So that's an estimate of support method. Transaction based, it's exactly what it sounds like. You would, for a period of time, and this seems kind of labor intensive to me. The The most often one I see is number 2, the proportional cost, but you might see transaction-based too, where someone will keep track of the actual total number of collections, for example, that they process for the enterprise fund versus the total number of transactions that they post in total. And so the next slide is going to show you an example of a calculation that you might do. So for example, an accountant, hours spent on enterprise activities per year versus divided by the total working hours per year of the accountant times the accountant's personnel budget. That might be the amount that you decide to attribute to the enterprise fund as indirect costs for the accountant for the fiscal year. And then this is basically the same calculation, but it's done based on number of transactions. So at the end of the presentation today, we're going to take questions. So if you have questions, you can feel free to ask them then. We are going to give you an opportunity for questions, but you also don't need to know this to fill out the A2, but I just thought since people had questions that we would cover it today. So for indirect costs, my final thoughts are whatever method is used to calculate indirect costs, it should be documented. There should be a policy developed and agreed to by everyone, whoever is responsible for passing policies in your community or approving policies, excuse me, whether that's the city council or select board, a policy should be written and adopted, and that policy should be consistently applied from year to year. Now, 5 years down the road, you might decide to change methods, and that's fine, but it should be redocumented and revoted, but it shouldn't change annually, is what I'm saying. You should pick a method and stick to it. So, general fund subsidy. This is probably going to be a surprise to a lot of people because I think there's a general misconception out there that enterprise funds are supposed to, by law, be self-sufficient, meaning that their revenues should cover their expenditures in total. But that's not the case. Enterprise funds, by law, don't have to be self-supporting. A municipality may choose to support the enterprise fund when revenues of the enterprise fund are insufficient to cover the enterprise fund budget. And this is called a general fund subsidy. And general fund subsidy is an amount of money appropriated for the enterprise fund budget from taxation or any available fund such as free cash, stabilization, or overlay surplus. And okay, so one thing I wanted to mention about general fund subsidies too is that enterprise fund subsidies have to be voted by the municipality. You can't just plug a number on the A2 and have it work itself out on the tax rate recap. It has to be voted by a city or town. So who completes the Form A2? Well, if you're a finance official, accounting finance officer here with us today, that would be you. And it varies in each municipality. Maybe somebody else completes the Form A2. It's generally the accountant, but it has to be signed by the accounting officer. We look for the accounting officer's signature on Form A2. So where do you find the Form A2 for the tax rate recap? It's in Gateway. And so the first thing you're going to do is log into Gateway using your username and password, your Gateway username and password. And if you have any Gateway user account issues or Gateway technical issues, other than a question on how to fill out a form, should go to your field rep. But if you're having like a technical computer problem, like Gateway doesn't seem to be acting like it's supposed to, like you can't save, you can't do something, you can reach out to Gateway support, and I've included their email address here. So you would log into Gateway, and you go to the tax rate module tab at the top of the page, and you see along the left side, there's going to be A2 enterprise funds. So where does the information come to complete the Form A2? It comes from two places. The first place is the vote of the legislative body taken at annual town meeting, and any other appropriation votes taken for the enterprise fund subsequent to the setting of the last annual tax rate. Those votes all belong in A2 column B, and we're going to go over that in a minute. But the prior year-end revenue ledger for the applicable enterprise fund is where you get the prior year actual amounts that appear in the A2 column A. So your actual revenue ledger for the enterprise fund for the year just closed is where you would find the actual revenues that are going to go in column A. So I hope everybody can see this well enough, but I dug out some city council votes for a community, and I'm going to go through these with you so that you can see how the amounts in these votes map to filling out the Form A2. So in this particular city, on July 13th of 2025, so just after they set the tax rate for 25. So now we're, it's after we've set the tax rate. So this vote, even though it pertains to fiscal year 25, is going to go into column B for the current year, the estimates for the current year. So what this community did is they transferred $3,200,000 from retained earnings, and they put it in a new water main capital fund. And what I did was code each of these amounts so you'll see where they go on the Form A2 when we get there. So this, even though you'd be tempted to put this in a retained earnings in column A, and we actually for this year deleted that cell, so you can't do it anymore. But this goes, even though it's intuitive that it would go in the 25 column, this is going to go in the 26 column. This vote is the actual city council order for this enterprise fund. It's a water enterprise fund for their fiscal year 26 budget. So they're saying that move that $22,665,313 be appropriated for the water enterprise fund, and that $2 million be included in appropriations to the general fund for indirect costs and be allocated to the water enterprise fund for funding, and that $24,665,313 be raised as follows. So they have user charges of $21,200,000, and that amount is going to be developed by, if the DPW director is in charge of the water enterprise fund, he will be assisting in putting together an estimate for the user charges. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But they're saying they're going to appropriate $3,465,314 from retained earnings of the enterprise fund, and that the budget is going to be a total of direct costs for the enterprise fund of $22,665,313, and they list all of the line items there, and they show the indirect costs, and you see that the enterprise fund balances, it's $24,665,313 of total costs. And then they voted another enterprise fund retained earnings vote. They took water retained earnings of $1,550,000, and they put it in a diesel fixed charge account. And that was done on May 27th of 2025. And so you see that transaction, again, those are coded with letters so that you can see later how they map onto the Form A2. And then I couldn't put my hands on this vote actually, but there was also a $50,000 transfer between two budget line items within the enterprise fund to cover a shortfall in one of the line items. And so there's, even though it's one vote, there's a revenue side of this vote and there's an expense side of this vote, right? So the revenue side is going to be they're transferring it from, let's say, a salary line item for laborers, and they're transferring it to another salary line for water inspectors or something. But so the revenue is the money that they're using from the unspent budget line item, and then the expenditure side is what they're going to spend the money on. So that's why that's coded an A and an E. And so you will see how that's treated when we go to the A2. So here we are, we're at Form A2. And the first section we're going to look at for completing the Form A2 is the revenue section. And so the user charges and other departmental revenue lines total the $21,200,000 that you saw from water revenues that they voted in the council vote. And that's all of the votes that are coded with a D, total that. And then all of the retained earnings votes that you saw, total the amount that is in the retained earning appropriation appropriated from July 1st, 2024 certification. So they went to town meeting or to council meeting on or around May 27th. So they were of 25. So they were still working from their June 30th of 24 certification. So that's why that goes on that line. Let's say that they were going to have another meeting now, and they had their June 30th of 25 free cash certified and their retained earnings certified, and they wanted to appropriate more retained earnings now. That would come from the new certification, and there would be an amount on the July 1st of 2025 certification line. I just want to point out that when you're filling out this form, it is important to make sure that you're putting the amounts voted from retained earnings on the proper certification line. So just think about the date that the retained earnings are being appropriated, and if it's prior to June 30th of when those retained earnings are going to expire, you would put them on the first line. And then if it's after the year has just ended, say fiscal year 25, and you're doing the 26 rate like this is, would go on the next line. But that's something to be careful for. And then the next thing we see is that $50,000 of a transfer within the enterprise fund. So that's going to go on the other enterprise fund available funds line. And the total cost, total revenues and available funds come to $29,465,314. And the revenues in both columns A and B should be shown on the appropriate line and not just lumped into the user fees line as $1 amount. And all votes taken after the last tax rate was set, again, I mentioned this earlier, belong in column B for both the revenues and the costs appropriated. So I showed you that the total revenues tied to the vote of the city council of the $21,200,000, but behind the scenes, there's a budget book or something somewhere that breaks out the revenue estimate between the user charges line and the other departmental revenue line. So you should split those out into their appropriate line. So if you have a large increase in your user fees line or your other departmental revenues line, we're going to want you to fill out this form. And this form can be found on the tax rate landing page. It's the user fees spreadsheet. And I think Jen has also put a link to this in the chat. And what we're going to look for on this is, okay, what's the old rate? And this happens to be for 25, but it works the same way. What's the old rate? What's the new rate? What's the dollar change and the percent change? And then you can put the fiscal 24 actual usage and the estimated usage for the current year. And all of that maths out, we joke around and we use that expression, maths out to an estimated revenue number. That estimated revenue number should approximate what's on the estimated revenues for the enterprise fund. What we're going to look for is that there's a reason that your revenues increased. And if it's related, it should be based on something. And again, we're not talking about a 1% increase in estimate for user fees over the prior year actual. We're talking, 5, 10, 15%. There should be a reason for it. Either it's going to be for a usage increase, maybe you have a new giant office building opening or a new medical facility opening that's going to drastically increase your usage. There should be a real reason for it. Otherwise, we're looking for a rate increase, a voted rate increase. And so along with completion of this form, we'll be looking for a copy of the vote to increase the rates by whoever is responsible to do that in your community, if it's a vote of the select board or the council. We're going to look for the date of the vote and what the effective date of the rate increase is. And the reason we want that is we like to see the rate increase be effective July 1st. Sometimes we see them effective January 1st. But if they're only effective January 1st, you have to realize that you're only going to get the 6-month benefit of the rate increase. So we'll want that annualized in the calculation on this user charges template. Again, any explanation for any usage increase, and we're going to want you to upload all of that documentation, including this spreadsheet, right to the Form A-2 prior to submitting the form to us. And again, I'll take any questions at the end related to that. So now we're looking at the second section of the Enterprise Fund Form A-2. This is the total costs appropriated section. And that's broken down into 2 parts. Part A is costs appropriated in the enterprise fund, and Part B is indirect costs appropriated in the general fund. And so costs appropriated in the enterprise fund, this comes right from the budget vote. So everything, if you go back and look, that has an A coded next to it would be in this section. And again, the budget should be broken out into its separate categories, not just all lumped on one line like salaries, wages, and expenses. If there's a capital component, that should be called out, and also debt service. Part B is where you would break out, where you would show the indirect costs. So you remember in the vote for the budget, they voted $2 million of indirect costs that the enterprise fund is going to repay to the general fund. And they didn't, this particular city, but I, as an example for you, broke out costs into each of the lines. So you would break out the indirect costs into each of their separate categories. And you'll see that the total costs come out to $29,465,314, which is what the total revenues came out to be. Part 3 is where we would show a calculation of any general fund subsidy if there is one. And so in this particular scenario, Total revenues equal total costs, so there is no general fund subsidy in this. I did, in a couple slides from now, show you what that would look like if there was a general fund subsidy. But in this particular one, there is no general fund subsidy calculated in Part 3. And any of the cells, I forgot to mention this, that are this tan color, those pre-fill for you. Those are either calculations or amounts that carry in from somewhere else on the form. So the final part of the Form A-2 is showing where the sources of funding for costs appropriated in the enterprise fund. So although we've seen that the total costs are $29,465,314, this section is asking only for the sources of funding for costs appropriated in the enterprise fund only. So that's Part 2A. So I'm saying, therefore, the amount here is $27,465,314. This amount must match the total in Part 2A. And it's this amount that gets carried to recap page 4, column F, from enterprise funds. And if you had multiple enterprise funds, it would be the same thing. It would be the sum of the enterprise funds. So now I'm going to show you what a general fund subsidy looks like. So in this particular scenario, you have user charges of $530,000. You had retained earnings of $175,650. So total revenues for this particular enterprise fund are $705,650. And you see Part 2, the salaries, wages, and expenses are $1,302,650. There are no indirect costs for this particular scenario. So you see the total costs are $1,302,650, far more than the enterprise fund revenues. So you see that reconciliation here in the calculation of subsidy section, Part 3, and you see that the negative represents a general fund subsidy. So they're going to have a $597,000 general fund subsidy. And so Part 4, the revenues and available funds of the enterprise fund, that is $705,650. And so let's go back to that revenue slide. So see that's where that's coming from. Those are the revenues of the enterprise fund. So that goes on this line 4A. But this particular community voted that general fund subsidy of $597,000 from taxation. And that then you see the total of $1,302,650 for the total sources of funding for costs in the enterprise fund. Now there's a twist on this. So the $705,650 is the amount that's going to carry forward to the enterprise fund column on recap page 4. And the reason for that is this $597,000 is already in the raise and appropriate column, column B on recap page 4. So you don't want to duplicate that. That amount has already been raised and appropriated for the enterprise fund subsidy in the general fund budget. And then finally, you're going to sign and submit the Form A-2 as the accountant. And that's it. So I'm happy to take any questions now. I'm going to get out of the presentation so I can see you. And I've included the field reps here. I think Jen included that in the chat as well. And you should feel free anytime to reach out And here's my email address. So I'm going to escape out of this. So Jen, do you see me?
I can still see you want to
I
stop sharing?
stop
Because we
sharing.
can still see your presentation.
Yep. Oh,
And then right now we have two questions. And these are from earlier in the presentation. The town transferred funds from the Finance Committee at the end of the fiscal year 25 to the Enterprise Fund on Form A2. Would I include this revenue as other departmental revenue as actuals for fiscal year 25?
so that that that's a transfer, but it was taken after the tax rate was set. So I would show the transfer of the revenue in the revenues section, and then I would show the cost that it's covering in the expenditure section. But I'm going to actually, so whoever asked that question, if you want to shoot me an email, and I'm going to follow up on that to make sure that that's the accurate answer. And I will double check on that. And we can also send out that answer to the participants.
Okay, great. So we have another question. How about the process to close an enterprise fund?
So when an enterprise fund terminates, you would let all the bills run out in the enterprise fund, and then any assets of the enterprise fund would transfer to the general fund, and any remaining retained earnings would transfer over to the general fund as well. And I actually had a slide in there about that, and then I thought it was too far in the weeds, so I deleted it. But yeah, so you let the bills run out in the enterprise funds, and the remaining collections come into the enterprise fund. And then at the end, you would just, once everything was settled, you would then close any assets to the general fund.
Okay, we have another question. Thank you, Deb. The town voted to lend GF general fund free cash for an enterprise capital project with a clause to be paid back in 2 years. Does this need to be recorded anywhere in Gateway?
So you would have the revenue source would be non-enterprise fund revenues that would show up at the bottom. So you would in the year that the appropriation was taking place, you would have a general fund subsidy of that dollar amount, and you would put that free cash vote at the bottom of the page. So that's where you would show it in Gateway. But you only have 2 years to pay back the general fund for a capital cost. I just want to emphasize that. So you can't have the general fund lend the enterprise fund resources and then go back 10 years later and try to recoup those from the enterprise fund. You have 2 years, and that's specified also in the enterprise fund manual.
And it sounds like that's what they did. They said with a clause to be paid back in 2 years.
Yep.
Here's another question. If a town is using free cash to subsidize an enterprise, would you recommend subsidizing through taxation instead, as free cash is only one-time revenues?
I mean, that's a local decision. Is if the reason for the subsidy is, so for example, a lot of the last mile broadband communities, until they were really up and running and collecting 100% of the user fees from all subscribers, for a little while, those communities had to have general fund subsidies. And in that case, the actual need for the general fund subsidy is temporary. So you'd have to look at it that way. I mean, you would apply the same rationale about use of one-time revenues for an enterprise fund purpose as you would for a general fund budgeting purpose. You wouldn't want to use one-time revenues for ongoing expenses. But again, that's a local decision. It's not law. You don't have to do it one way or the other.
So from your question earlier about how about the process to close an enterprise funds, they followed up and said any votes. So I'm not sure if that makes sense to you. It doesn't necessarily to me.
Now,
Um,
I mean, you would take a vote to close the enterprise fund as of a particular date. And as of that particular date, you would stop booking any transactions to the enterprise fund, and you wouldn't submit an A2 for that fiscal year for that enterprise fund. You would just let whatever residual transactions that took place before that date run out in the enterprise fund, because that's where it was budgeted originally. But then I guess I'm not sure what is meant by any votes. So if you want to send me a specific question, I can handle that.
we have another question. Would an assessment paid to the enterprise fund for services provided to the town, EMS, be considered a general fund subsidy?
Can you read that again? It
Yep.
sounds like the town is billing the enterprise fund.
Would an assessment paid to the enterprise fund for services provided to the town, EMS, be considered a general fund subsidy?
I guess I don't understand the question, really. I don't understand the scenario.
I think just as a reminder to folks for your specific questions like this that are very specific, it's best to probably reach out to your field advisor. And, I did put the link in, and you should feel free to reach out directly to them and ask them these questions or to Deb. That way, there can be a little bit more clarification
Yeah.
on your part. There can be a back and forth. Um, and right now, I'm not seeing any additional questions. If anyone wants to take a minute and put another question in, or if there's any questions, now's your chance. Um, The plan will be to share the recording and the presentation and any links shared during the presentation via email will probably come to you next week. We also will highlight the availability of the recording and other materials in an upcoming city and town. So there's ample opportunities to find this content. Um, I don't see any additional questions. So at this time, I'd like to thank Deb for sharing this information regarding the A2 form and enterprise funds. Um, and we'll see you at the next webinar.
Thanks, everyone.